I live again.
Hello everyone and welcome. This is the mostly unedited, complete version of my conversation with Nick Newhard, the creator of Blood, which we recorded for the Forgotten Gems episode on said game, Blood. And we talked about the making of the game, a lot of developer insights, and other things we stumbled across. I hope you enjoy it. So, hey Nick, welcome and thank you for joining me on this one.
Hey Ragnar, thanks for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about Blood and the new release.
The pleasure is all mine, really. Alright, let's just dive right into the questions. So, Nick, Blood was released a good 1.5 years after Duke Nukem 3D. So, was Blood always intended to be a game based on 3D Realms' build engine? Or did the game idea originate before that opportunity? Tell us a bit about, how the idea ended up in Build.
Sure. So do you want the short version or the long version?
Try the long version.
Sure. So I got to provide you with some background, so bear with me. In 1992, I was working at SSI, Strategic Simulations, and they made CRPGs. And Wolfenstein 3D came out, and many of us there enjoyed it and played it late into the night, probably interrupted some of our work. Contemporaneously, SSI was offered the 3D engine that was later used in Ultima Underworld, and SSI turned it down.
Yes.
Yeah, that's probably one of your favorites too.
I had lost a lot of time in Ultima Underworld.
Yeah, the game company SSI turned it down, and a lot of our internal folks, our development team, desperately wanted to try something new in CRPGs, and we couldn't understand why they decided to pass on such great technology. Anyway, later on, for part of 92 and 93, I worked with a team in Redmond, Washington to create an edutainment title called Think of Things, and much of that team later became founders of Monolith. So then, during that time, right towards the end of that project, I contacted Apogee's Scott Miller and George Broussard through a friend, thanks Diana, and met them to discuss how we could move forward with a project, any project. And in late 93, they flew me out there. I got to drive George Broussard's NSX, thanks George, and I met with Apogee and got to visit id during the final throes of Doom development and see the early version of the build engine. And honestly, I jumped at the chance to start Apogee West, which was sort of a precursor to Q Studios, and to create a horror game for the upcoming engine. They had an idea in mind of what they wanted to create. They sort of had this portfolio plan in mind, and horror was one of those. So that's how it started. And we had always planned to be a build engine game, but what Blood was going to be really hadn't been decided, other than it was a horror genre game.
Interesting. Yeah, very interesting. So you said you had great ideas for CRPGs, wanted to, push the genre in certain directions. Do you remember some of the cool ideas you had that you couldn't realize at that time?
You mean at SSI? Oh, sure. So we had the D&D license, the Dungeons & Dragons license from TSR.
Right, I remember. Right.
Yeah, we, the company did the Gold Box games, and we did Buck Rogers Countdown Till Doomsday, and we did Dark Sun Shadowlands. That was the game that I was on. And what we really wanted to do was to try something that was more first-person shootery at the time. But there was definitely a contingent of hardcore CRPG enthusiasts that did not want to do that, and they were nice guys and everything, but they were the ones in charge, and they were like, well, this is a little too far out there for us and a little too expensive for us, so they passed at it. But we still, many in the team, including myself, wanted to make a CRPG that would have been 3D, that would have been Dungeons & Dragons, and wished that it happened earlier. But in any case, the past is the past, and the world has some great Dungeons & Dragons games now.
Oh, indeed, yeah. It's a big what if, right?
Yeah, it is, exactly right.
Yeah. So, looking back from the world we're living in, especially in hindsight concerning Blood, and after 2 decades of FPS evolution, what is it about the classic 2.5D shooter that is, in comparison to a lot of modern first-person shooters, that makes them still hold up so well, even 20 years after release?
Wow. So, after Rise of the Triad, which used a revamped Wolf 3D engine, there were 3 games that were core to that portfolio, the 3D Realms portfolio, and all of them were using the build engine game. And those eventually became Duke Nukem 3D, Blood, and Shadow Warrior. But honestly, before that, the pioneers of the 2.5D shooters were id Software with Wolf 3D and Doom. So Doom came out after we had started the agreement to develop Blood, but before Blood development had started in earnest. And I think also probably before Duke Nukem 3D came out. So that's definitely one of the ancestral inspirations for games.
Yes.
The other company was LucasArts with Dark Forces, and kind of those three games were really the inspiration for probably all games at some point in the 2.5D genre. So on one hand,
genre defining, basically.
They really were. So on one hand, like teams using the build engine were disadvantaged because we didn't really control the development of the engine. But on the other hand, Ken Silverman provided us with the build engine and hooks into that engine and to its editor. And Ken was open to really like cool ideas and changing things when we really needed. Sometimes we had to push because like it changed his schedule. He's the one guy working on this engine, but we always got great stuff.
That was really just Ken Silverman, right?
It really was just Ken Silverman working on the engine. Now, to be fair, to be candid, like the build engine isn't the same as say like the Unreal. The build engine isn't the same as the Unreal engine. It doesn't have all of the extra systems that it needed. So we had to build those, and that's why there's such a difference between Duke Nukem and Blood and Shadow Warrior and all of the other subsequent build engine games, is because we all had to create our own game systems really around them. Not just the gameplay, but like any functional systems for moving sprites around to moving sectors and that sort of thing. So that is, for example, how the Blood team worked with Ken to create sector over sector or room over room, those systems used in Blood, and it's also how it ended up in Duke and Shadow Warrior, because once we had brainstormed it with him, like Ken would come and stay at my house, and we would sit there and hash out these great ideas, and he built this onto the sector over sector system, and then it slipped into Duke and Shadow Warrior, which, to be honest, was a little frustrating to us because we were the ones that helped sort of push that idea, but at the same time, like, it made all the games better, and I think we still used it to the best effect in Blood.
Oh yeah, really. I mean, Duke Nukem was really, when the game came out, especially the first level, immediately it feels like it just screams, this is now vector over sector. It just shoves it in your face, like, we can do this. So I totally get what you're saying, that it's...
The limitations of 2.5D like drove those technological innovations, and like others like these before the era of full 3D games. Now, admittedly, while we were in development on Blood, Quake came out, so Quake was technically also inspiration to us, but we're specifically talking about 2.5D here.
Exactly, yeah.
So really, for us, it was about that technology, also all about gameplay, the simplicity of the 2.5D tools, and the simplicity of the 2.5D pipeline, like getting sprites and art into the game, and our ability to extend that functionality really allowed the Blood team to focus on gameplay and fun first. So even though we had to build all these systems on top of it, like from a content creator's perspective, from the artist's perspective, and from me as a designer, and also a gameplay implementer, like I could focus on the fun factor first. When Peter Fries came on board fairly early on in development, he saw the potential for the build engine to be expanded and created gameplay systems and features like 3D audio and software like nobody'd done that before. And he focused on like technical excellence and extensibility. Those were important to him, but he also knew that like it was all in service to creating the fun experience and exciting gameplay that we were really aiming for. So those foundational systems that he created allowed the rest of us to focus on implementing game design and content. And made life a hell of a lot easier for the rest of us. Kevin Kihlstrom was the lead artist, pretty much the artist on the game. And because Peter created these easy-to-use tools like a palette management system and a sprite animation tool and these user interface tools.
Yeah, art edit and edit art.
Exactly, yeah. And the Flute Manager or whatever it was called. But like we were able to put those immediately to use in the game. It allowed us to like do things like transition palettes when we needed to, which allowed more colors and better looking art in the game. Although we still ended up with a lot of browns and grays, like many other games. We had 256 colors to work with, and we used way more than that. It was sort of transitional, which is why some levels look a little bit more brown and some levels look a little more green and gray and blue. So I guess or hope that it would have been the same, like going back to your question, it would have been the same for the other 2.5D games. The simplicity of the tools and pipeline allowed them to focus on content and gameplay innovations first, much like we saw in Doom, because they were the first, but also in Dark Forces, where we saw a lot of gameplay innovations in terms of weaponry that we leveraged in Blood and made even better, honestly. Like the whole Guns Akimbo thing. Yeah, they had two guns in a couple of places, but we tried to use it everywhere.
Like, it's always fun to use two napalm launchers.
Yes, it is.
No, but yeah, it's laser focused production pipeline on gameplay, really. Okay, fascinating. Yeah, let's go to the gameplay chapters. Like, to me, the biggest appeal of Blood was the extremely organic level design. So for you and the design team, what inspired this particular brand of level design with like realism and challenge as defining hallmarks? And are there any memorable anecdotes about, trying to strike this right balance?
Sure, I'll answer that first part. The team was really heavily inspired by movies. That's really obvious.
Yeah, very obvious.
But particularly horror movies and the motifs in them. You could see in Kevin Killstrom's art, which often in turn inspired our level design. That said, we were kind of always pushing the envelope. If you look at levels like Wrong Side of the Tracks, the train level, or the underwater level.
Legendary.
It totally was, right? And honestly, I think, as far as I remember, it's the first train level ever in a 2.5D or 3D game.
I remember that Outlaws did that later on, but I think that was after.
That's right.
After Blood.
Yeah, or at least in terms of design, it was after. So the underwater levels, the use of sector over sector to expand that mobility and strategy, both in the single player or co-op and Bloodbath maps, especially I guess in Bloodbath maps. Having things like destructible walls and floors also tied to sector over sector. I think that created a level of realism, but there's more to it than that. We agonized over the movement and physics of the game, whether it was the jibs flying all over the place, depending on how you pronounce it could be gibs. But anyway, we won't talk about that. That's a war of like GIF or GIF. Anyway,
whole different can of worms.
Yeah. So, but talking about movement and physics specifically of our sprites, there was a lot of agonizing, and I guess one of the anecdotes is this: we reached a point where there were some arguments between team members about movie realism versus realism.
Yes.
And we sat down, I think 4 of us or 5 of us sat down in my kitchen. So Blood's development was mostly done out of my house to start with, at least up until like mid-alpha or the start of beta. And we sat down at my kitchen table and we argued, I would say, for probably 4 or 5 days, back and forth, all of our concepts. And it was good argument. It wasn't, it wasn't angry argument, although there was definitely some anger sometimes. But we sat and argued about like how movement should work and what should be real versus what should be, not real, but more fun oriented. The thing, throwing TNT, how that should feel. But especially we focused on movement and the turning rate. And one of the things, of course, we all loved at the time was Doom. So that was sort of that was a key factor, was saying like, we want our rotation, just our mere rotation, to be much more like Doom. And I won't go into all the technical details, but to say that it's not just a single movement speed. There is more to it. There's kind of a threshold that it reaches before it speeds up. And we wanted to imitate and improve on that, both in terms of the rotational speed and also movement. And it shows in our Bloodbath matches when you're playing multiplayer and you're fighting someone else, like just the sheer frenetic pace at which it runs is a goal. That's what we wanted to achieve.
That's definitely something I'm going to go into in the later parts of the video excessively. You're going to see.
All right. So yeah, you can see that was one of our focuses, and we sat down for a week and hashed it all out. And I won't say who was pushing what, but we had to push for realism. One shot, one kill kind of things. But we also had to push for man, you could soak a lot of damage, and we changed the game as a result of that in a lot of ways. And we added things like more armor, and while some people might go, oh man, there's just too many, why do we need all these armor types? For us, that was an RPG, probably for me more than anybody, that was an RPG kind of element that we wanted in the game. You had an inventory of keys, you had the ability to use your med pack later in the game. Those are things we wanted, I guess, to sort of represent our thoughts, our desires for the game, and we think they came out pretty well.
I would agree so, honestly. And yeah, this really reflects also my personal experience with the game. That was one of the things that always stood out to me, versus in contrast to other build games, that it's it was just this sheer spectacle, especially, as you said, especially in the Bloodbath matches, that just took it to a whole other level. Yeah. Okay. So with this question, I kind of feel like you just kind of answered both of these. So I'm not gonna ask question 5 I'm just gonna jump over to the one about style, setting, and everything.
Actually, if you do have something, if you want to go ahead and ask Five, I've got some pretty good answer about some priorities. I think it's important.
Okay.
So
super good. Okay, let's just do this.
Let's do it.
All right. So, generally speaking, what were your biggest gameplay and design priorities for Blood? Were there any specific aspects about shooters that came before where you felt that needed to be improved on in Blood? Like, was there anything that made you feel like this is my opportunity to finally do exactly the way I want to have it in a first-person shooter?
Sure. I think three things. From its conception, we wanted Blood to have a memorable protagonist and to tell a story. While that story changed vastly over time and is spotty in places, our cinematic videos are not, in retrospect, like the best place for telling that story. We feel like, I believe the team feels like the story of Caleb, his rebirth and his vengeance was told well enough. So I think we told that story. Now, admittedly, that was a different story from when we brainstormed the game, which I'm happy to talk about. The multiplayer gameplay, that had to be spot on. So I won't say that was my second priority. It's just second that comes to mind. It had to be spot on, and we had to have both deathmatch, which we called Bloodbath, and cooperative play. Had to have those, and I'm really glad we did. I can tell you an anecdotal story about that later. Bloodbath had to be fast and frenetic and over the top. You called it a spectacle. I think that's a great description. You had to be able to play with a friend because our AI could be, in many places, really hard to beat alone. Right? We balanced the AI, and in retrospect, this was probably a bad idea, but we balanced the AI for our skills, for our skill levels of playing the game. Okay, so thirdly, we had to improve and innovate where we could. That was the goal. Like, look at these games that are out there right now, and there were three, and then Quake came out, and we innovated on that too. But there were three, and we wanted to innovate in gameplay and AI and weaponry and the tech that we used, like the 3D audio that we had. If you shoot a napalm launcher at someone else in multiplayer mode, you hear that napalm blast go by you, and it changes in pitch just like it would in a real 3D audio system.
Or like a Doppler effect.
It does, yeah. So if I were to build Blood all over again, those three would still be a priority.
Awesome, yeah. Well, I'm glad that we went into this. That's some good stuff there, yeah.
Thank you.
Blood setting is one of the most unconventional blends of different styles and themes I've ever come across. That's a compliment in my book. So Nick, I'm wondering, how did the initial idea come together, and how did it turn into the Blood that we know today with its one-of-a-kind flavor of pitch-black humor?
So you're a fan of long stories, so I'm going to go ahead and give you the long version of this too. So
yes, go the scenic route.
Yeah, exactly. Blood was conceived as a more serious game in the horror genre originally, with protagonists and creatures that paid homage to the worlds of H.P. Lovecraft. So it was a lot darker, creatures that were a lot different than we ended up with. That original design was created in partnership with my late friend Christopher Rush of Magic the Gathering fame, and he was responsible for a lot of the amazing concept art that we had that was never published. It was around that time that two things happened. So George Broussard contacted us. He'd seen a build, he'd seen some design ideas, and he asked if we could do something to make the game a little more campy. And then at that same time, Peter Atkinson or Richard Garfield, one of those two, called Chris and asked him to come work on Magic the Gathering. And Chris and I talked it over, like we were longtime friends from high school. So he was torn at the prospect of leaving Blood and the Lovecraftian works that he had sort of already started creating. But he also wanted to work on Magic full-time, and he was already working on it part-time, but now it's this full-time gig. And honestly, like, I had no intention of swaying him. We were still in brainstorming mode for Blood. Like, it wasn't in production yet, like full production. We were a team of two doing just the brainstorming part, and he was passionate about art and even controlling, to be honest, like controlling his art future. And it sounded like it was going to be moving a little bit away from that and more campy. And Peter or Richard made that offer, and it just made sense. So at that point, the engine wasn't very far along, build wasn't very far along, and Peter Fries hadn't joined the team yet. So I focused on programming things like the build engine fundamentally that it's fundamentally supported, but didn't inherently provide system level code for. I've already mentioned that. Like it's a really raw engine. So I focused on things like moving sectors and lighting changes and moving platforms and whatnot. And Ken had some examples of these in code, but they were simple and hard-coded, so I wanted to expand on that and make them more systemic. Sorry, I'm getting a little off track here about the content, but
No problem.
like what's important is that Blood started off with a more serious tone, and all that changed when Kevin Killstrom came on board. So I've probably said this elsewhere, in a previous interview or whatever, but we all like the horror genre to some extent, but Kevin was in love with it, and we hired him in part because he wowed us with his movie prop style drawings and sculptures and animatronics and his encyclopedic knowledge of the horror movie genre. And it will probably embarrass Kevin if I say this, but his ability to quote Bruce Campbell while actually looking like a blonde version of Bruce Campbell is pretty uncanny. Anyhow, once we started adding movie quotes and more horror motifs, and it just never really stopped until we launched Blood. Like, that was a continuous process, and everybody on the team contributed. I'm pretty sure that our team exceeded George Broussard's expectations for campiness, and the entire team contributed to that transformation. The dev team, like I mentioned, worked out of my family room, and even on the toughest days, and we had some tough ones, had a really humorous side to it. Sometimes, actually mostly, really dark humor. After we became part of Monolith, the biggest contributions from Monolith, from the other parts of the team outside the core team, came from the audio group. Daniel Bernstein, Guy Whitmore, James Ackley, and Cass Thruston, and of course Jace Hall, who does the voice announcer of Bloodbath Kills in the game. Like, without those guys, like, we probably wouldn't have had a very good music or sound effect side. We were already working with a third party, and it wasn't jiving like with the expectations. And I think what it did, what the music did and what the audio did, was it created the darker side of Blood, while we were able to, on the design side, sort of maintain the humor. So it really created this dichotomy of the darkness and humor all together. And of course the humor came out from some of the audio too. Stephen Waite, the voice of Caleb, his work was a tremendous inspiration to us outside of the things we scripted. Caleb singing show tunes wasn't a planned thing.
If you're blue and you don't know where to go to, putting on the Ritz.
And that voice work happened between takes, but it was so good we found ways to use it in the game, and it created the character. It profoundly enhanced Caleb's personality. So
The Caleb is memorable because of that voice.
Absolutely.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, going on to the next chapter, and I'm talking about Nightdive's remaster, Fresh Supply of Blood. And my question would be, and one that many people were interested in, is to know if you had a chance to play the remake yet. And if yes, what's your opinion on it? How did you feel about it? And honestly, just feel free to take the gloves off if you must.
Yeah, I have played through several levels, and it gave me an opportunity to show Blood to my youngest son, who's a bit more into games like Warframe and Team Fortress right now. The team's done an amazing job getting the play working identically to the original, and to the point where I'm a bit embarrassed that some of our AI bugs are still there. Yeah. Also, the sound works much better than past times I've played in DOSBox, so kudos to the team for that as well.
Yeah, I'm sure they're happy to hear that. And from what lead programmer Sam Villarreal told me, they even went so far as to reproducing some of the most well-known bugs, like gargoyles not hitting you when you're on the floor and stuff like that, to keep it as original as possible. And I guess to make the purists as happy as possible. Alright, let's just get on to the next question, and you've teased it already, the multiplayer section. I'm really quite curious, how important was the development of a solid multiplayer mode for you and your team when making Blood? And just like before, were there any aspects about it that were especially important for you to get right?
Sure. I would say focusing again on the split between Bloodbath mode and cooperative play. We wanted cooperative play to feel like your friend mattered, or whoever you were playing with. We wanted it to feel it had to matter, which is why I think in retrospect, one reason we left AI as strong as it was it mattered to. And we hadn't worked on any systems like scaling outside of our invisible handicapping system that most people didn't know about, but there was this invisible handicapping system you could turn on. We didn't work on that specifically for the creatures, the enemy AI. It was mainly for player versus player. So cooperative mode had to feel like your friend mattered, and that you could bring them along. And so I guess that's one focus, is just making sure that we had cooperative play. I mentioned to you an anecdotal story. So I was at E3 after Blood was released, and much of the core team was walking around and happened to see John Romero there, and
Okay.
he introduced me to one of my heroes, Jordan Mechner, creator of
Yes.
Prince of Persia. Yeah. So, and he was sitting there, and John was introducing me since we'd met before. I can tell you that story some other time, but we'd met before at id, and he said, "This is Nick Newhard, one of the creators of Blood," and he said the best multiplayer game since Doom 2, and by that time,
Oh, shots fired.
dude. And by that time, Quake was out, so I had great feelings about that. I don't mind saying I walked away feeling really, really proud of the work that I and the team did on Blood when he said that, because like John Romero was recognizing bloodbath mode and cooperative play, and he said, "I am so glad you got in cooperative play." And I said, "You can't believe that. I am too." Like, that was an option. Like, losing cooperative play for game development time could have happened, but we didn't. We kept it in there. So on the note about bloodbath play, like
Yes.
we talked about it before, is keeping bloodbath fast and frenetic, pulse pounding. Some of the levels in there are small enough that it could be problematic if there were too many players in there. We could talk about that a little bit later, but ultimately, like, the player is constantly pressured to move, hide, grab things, and not die, and to fight back. Like, and that was really the goal, is just to make them feel like the other Calebs were after them. And you can feel that in the soccer map, and the name suddenly escapes me, but the soccer map is very much like that. And I think that's one of my, like,
I think it's something like kicking heads or
something. Or something about the heads, exactly. And like, watching videos of people playing that is still fun for me, because people really take that map seriously when it comes to bloodbath mode.
That is so cool. Like, that is such a fun...
Yeah,
That's quite a fun gimmick. Yeah, and okay, this I need to ask specifically for myself personally, because as I've said earlier in the video, the level Midgard, BB7, is hands down literally my favorite multiplayer map of all time. It really is. Is there any trivia or any thoughts or any anecdotes about this map that you can share how this came together?
Well, so Midgard is probably like our smallest bloodbath map, and since I was talking about small maps earlier,
Yes.
and at least it's the smallest I recall offhand. And BB8, the kicking head,
It's very compact. It's very compact.
Yeah. It might be simpler, but it's larger and much flatter. And BB7 is not very flat. Both have their own charm, I suppose. I would say either Craig Hubbard or Jay Wilson took over development of BB7. So Terry Hamill, who was one of our early artists, and I worked on that at different times. Like, when it got new textures, I think Kevin did some fantastic new textures, and that just really set the tone for what it looked like visually. But anyway, they would probably say something like, so this is my anecdote, which is really more of a fake quote, but something like, Nick made this cool looking map area and it was way too big, or had way too many sectors, or we don't know what the hell he was thinking. So we pared it down into this amazingly tight experience where players are constantly under pressure to fight, scavenge, hide, or die. Something like that, pithy but informative, because I was doing lots of things. I had my hands in everything on the game except for art, which was really Kevin's purview, but I had my hands in the financial and biz side of things, which I was pretty much doing a lot during that. The design side of things, the level design side of things, and the programming side. I did all of those in various capacities and in various percentages of my time. So I would often play with new levels or create new levels so that I could test out things that I was implementing in gameplay. And for BB7, it just happened to be one of those things where I got really enamored of the texture and the lighting that I was able to do with it and create these really cool looking areas. And it had a fairly low frame rate when I first worked on it. Like a few of the maps that have my, like, if it says it's got like my name on the credit, it's more than likely like one section of it or two sections of it or whatever, or the theme was created by me and then someone took it over and made it really a bitchin' map. Someone, Craig or Jay made it really great.
I think it was credited to Craig.
Okay, so that makes sense. He probably changed a crap load of things and made some of the moving sectors a lot better. He made it a lot more frenetic, and that's really what it amounted to. Was like, I created cool looking areas because while I was testing out ideas, I just wanted the feel. I wanted the nature of Blood to sort of show through, and then those guys made the levels a lot more wonderful.
Awesome. Yeah, I love hearing about this. It's wonderful.
Sure.
Just anecdotal for me, I'm going to put this in the video in a different segment, but just so you get a little bit of context in case you're interested. Like, Midgard, like, at the time I was I don't know, 14-ish or so, and I had like 2 friends, and we had an office that was the father's office, and they had a local area network there that we could constantly, after work, access. And literally after school, when they were not in the office, going in there and playing Midgard was a regular pastime activity for us for literally years.
It really was a great map, and it was super frenetic because there, even though there were places to hide, there were very few places to hide. And when you respawned, sometimes you could respawn and die right away, which kind of sucks, but it happened to everybody, so it didn't really matter. Like ultimately, if you were a good player, the deathmatch, the bloodbath counts evened out, so to speak.
Yeah,
it showed your skill level.
There's like these alleyways on top where a player can hide in between.
That's
and
right.
I think in Midgard it perfectly showed this, what you describe as this effectfulness of blood, where in terms of how the entities react to stuff. Like when somebody gets shot in one of these alcoves by the napalm launcher, the physics engine literally propels them out through the entire map screaming. This is one of the best spectacles I've ever had in multiplayer shooters, and we couldn't get enough of this, seriously.
That's awesome.
It was a great time. All right, before we leave, do you have any other memorable, unprompted anecdotes from the making of Blood that you'd love to share with us? And, shoot the breeze. Feel free. That's what it's here for.
Wow, I've already given you several anecdotes. I'm happy to talk about more. I mean, I guess one of them was inspirational, and then I have something else I'd like to say at the end. But one of them was very inspirational. I mentioned the fact that I got to visit id fairly early on. In fact, before Doom was released, and that was just Apogee and id hooking up before 3D Realms was like fully established, or it might have been around the same time. They're the same entity, but they're just different names. But I don't think the name, and of course we hadn't been working on the build engine at this point. But I got to visit id and meet John Carmack, who this may be an apocryphal story, I'm not sure, but if I recall correctly, he came in that day, John Carmack did, and he was talking about how he had this dream or concept or idea just that morning about how he could improve Wolfenstein I think it was for NES at the time, and it was, I believe, the inspiration for BSPs. So that's, like, for me, a really cool thing, because I love the fact that how BSPs really sort of changed the story when it came to game development for a lot of games.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah, but the other thing is I got to meet John Romero, who's a character, as many people know, and he showed Deathmatch to me for the first time, along with the next systems that they were using. But he showed Bloodbath off, Deathmatch off, and he was playing, I think, with Adrian, and they were yelling back and forth. They had offices that were pretty separated, and whenever John got a kill, he would quickly telephone Adrian or whoever else was playing with him, and he had this device that just played swearing words. Fuck you, that kind of, sorry, you'll have to cut that. But anyway, the point being is that he would play that every single kill, and it was awesome. It was incredible. And I would say that it was probably a precursor, at the time the tech wasn't available, it was a precursor to things like Dwango and being able to talk at the same time while you're playing, and to really roast the other person. So that was inspirational to us, because when I watched them playing, it was inspirational to me to think about like how fast and frenetic multiplayer could be. And you could see how it ended up in some of our text, and the voice, right? That was
how many words are there that describe how other people get mangled and disemboweled? I don't know. It's a long list.
It was a long list that was generated over not just one sitting. it was over time. Yeah. So that's the anecdote, I guess, that I have right now. I would say that if you don't mind, I'd like to end at least this part with a request and an apology of sorts and an announcement. So the first part, the request, is a little bit heavy. So it's not a bad thing for me, but like I have a best friend and two family members, some in-laws of mine, that are both affected by multiple sclerosis. So 200 people a week are diagnosed in the U.S. with it every week. So if anybody of your audience like has either the resources or the time to just check it out and see if they can find a way to help like one of the MS societies that's out there, I'd really appreciate that. So an apology of sorts.
Link is in the description.
That's awesome. Thank you. An apology of sorts. So My name is listed as lead programmer in Blood, and while that is quite true from roughly alpha on, honestly, Peter Fries is the unsung hero here of the game, and he was the lead programmer from, maybe several months into development where we really started building our team. I think he was our second full-time team member after Chris had left, and he took over the core development. His contributions, his game systems, all those things created a foundation by which I could create gameplay. And it was, and while it doesn't take away from the sting, I so to speak, of like him not getting that lead programmer credit, like I was pushed to like keep the credits short. I don't even know why. Like looking back, I'm like, that's a stupid thing. But keep the credits really short. Just put your name where you feel like it needs to be, and I did. But like Peter Fries deserves big kudos for his game development of Blood. And like I said, he was really the lead programmer, like the person doing most of the coding work of all the game systems, that foundational UI, all those tools before we became part of Monolith. So I took over the title because I took over all the work, and I did like much of the AI and UI and networking. I had to revamp all the networking stuff, and of course more gameplay, adding in capture the flag. Those things were what I was about, like the gameplay. But Peter was all about the foundational systems and deserves the credit. So Peter, thank you, and I apologize that you did not get the credit you deserved in the game.
Setting the record straight.
Setting the record straight. And the last is an announcement. I'm going to be starting a new project next week. I can't talk much about the project, but I can talk about the people. I'm going to be working with one of my heroes, Bill Roper, of Blizzard, Blizzard fame, and at Flagship. And I'll also be working with another friend of mine, Serena Robar, who many people haven't heard of, but she's been a producer in the game industry, and she's our CEO. And Jason Robar, her husband, who has been in the game industry a long time in multiple things, and started several of our studios, including one that I went to work for and was a co-founder in, Ceekur Studios, which became Vivendi or Sierra Online Seattle, the fourth incarnation of Sierra. So anyway, we're going to be starting a new project. I can't say a whole lot about it now, but I do want to say that I'm very interested in making sure that you guys see our future products.
Very excited for it.
Thank you.
I'm excited for it.
Thank you.
I think the viewers will be excited now too. Well, Nick, it was really great talking to you. Thank you for joining me on this. This was fun and informative and exciting.
It was my pleasure, and I hope I was able to provide some informative and fun answers. And again, I look forward to talking to you again in the future about future games. Thanks, Ragnar. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you all so much for watching and listening, and I'll see you guys soon. Ta-ta.